Hi, and welcome to your Urban Connection. Remember, this is the channel that is often imitated but never duplicated. And today I have the honor of having a special guest, and his name is Professor Andrew Carl. He's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia. And welcome to the show, Mr. Carl.
Well, thank you for having me.
Mr. Carl, it's my understanding now that you have written a book. And I want you to tell us, first of all, a little bit about how long you've been in the profession that you're in right now.
Sure. So I've been a professor of history and African American studies here at the University of Virginia since 2015. Previously, I taught at Marquette University, and I got my PhD in 2008.
Okay. Okay. Now, sir, you have written a book, and I hope you have a copy of the book there because while I have not read the book, I have not had the opportunity to read it yet. Okay. The Black Tax. Hold it up there a little bit longer because uh, okay, hold it just for a minute. I want people to get to the title. Okay, that's fine. Now, uh, like I said, I have not read the book. I've read some excerpts from it, and I'm very intrigued. It appears to me that you've taken a path that very few others have dared to take. Okay, and I would like for you to tell me a little bit about what was it that motivated you to do this research and write this book.
Well, two things. I mean, for one, just to give you a bit of a sense, the book is really tells a history of local taxation in America from the perspective and through the experiences of African Americans. And in particular, focusing on the ways in which local tax systems have been abused, have generated racially inequitable results. Um, and some of the effects of that over time. And I kind of link this to larger inequalities within housing markets, within schools and goods and public services, as well as within wealth building in America. And it was motivated by a couple of things. One was a kind of historiographical or sort of academic sort of I guess, sort of area that I saw it was lacking amongst historians who've looked at the African American experience and have looked at U.S. history more broadly. There's been a lack of recognition of how local tax systems, or in particular how our fiscal system as a whole has contributed to or played a role in both creating and perpetuating racial and economic inequalities. And also more sort of troubling was this invisibility, as I saw it, of African Americans as taxpayers within both the academic and public discourse. And this has real consequences in terms of the ways in which these sort of vicious lies, myths about who pays taxes and who gets public dollars, which has played a role in shaping our politics both today and in the past. One of the things that kind of really, kind of motivated me early on in this project was, if you recall, back in 2012 during the presidential election that year, when candidate Mitt Romney infamously said that 47% of Americans didn't pay any taxes at all, which is just an outright lie. But it sort of tapped into these myths about sort of who actually sort of pays, and then by implication, then who deserves the public's money. And that's been a sort of force that I have seen has been used to justify austerity and deprivations toward poor and predominantly Black populations, and has been used to kind of craft, sort of a political arguments. Really, I mean, again, we can see this going back to the Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. But I think what I found was that there was a much longer history of that myth making was really foundational to the sort of making of the Jim Crow state, to the gross inequities in public school funding, dating back to the Jim Crow era and continuing forward to today. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was begin to look closely at, well, what was the experience of African Americans as taxpayers? How did this system actually work in practice? And in particular, one of the things I found early on that really got me going on this project was finding evidence of how often African Americans, were experiencing overtaxation, like both intentional or structural. And in particular, when it comes to property taxes, how local tax assessors, as I found, early on in my research, back during the Jim Crow era, were intentionally overvaluing, for tax purposes, the land and homes that African Americans owned, at the same time as those same local governments were grossly underserving the very communities that were paying those tax dollars. So that was kind of really what sparked my interest in looking at the long history of this, as well as sort of what the implications are for policy debates today.
Sure. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that you talk about in this book, you talk about the United States, and I assume you're talking about the United States government, has stolen $600 billion from Black African Americans through unfair taxes post-slavery. Now, I want to ask you, how did you arrive at that figure?
Well, I think one thing I want to sort of be clear on here is I'm saying that essentially, these practices, these features of how property taxes are administered and enforced, have resulted in the loss of, material losses that I, again, conservatively estimate. And again, this is the most conservative estimate to be upwards of $600 billion, if not much more. And what I mean by that is, one, or I guess how I arrived at this. And again, this is a sort of a back of the envelope estimation here. It wasn't one that, we can, because many of these you cannot sort of really clearly pin down. But where I arrived at that sort of estimate was, one, there was a extensive study that was done by two economists in 2020, a nationwide study that found that African-American homeowners and property in Black neighborhoods across the U.S. is overassessed between 10 and 12% higher than white-owned homes in white neighborhoods. And what they estimated is that essentially, means, and what, using those figures, we could calculate that essentially what that meant is that every Black person in America, whether they owned a home or not, because again, these assessments are place-based, which means that essentially, even if you don't own the home you live in, if you're paying rent, you're paying that overtax. And what that adds up to, most conservatively, would mean essentially that every Black person in America today is paying $100 more in property taxes every year. Now, those are the numbers today. As my book shows, that is been a consistent feature of property tax administration for the last 150 years. In fact, 10 to 12% over assessment is actually on the low end of the scale of overtaxation that Black neighborhoods and Black homeowners and landowners have faced. And so if you just take that number and just say, all right, $100 a year for every Black person in America, and then go back for the past 150 years, you add that up and you're getting up right there alone, you're getting about $300 billion. Now, the other part of my study, the other part of this story, is not just the overassessment of African American neighborhoods and homes, but also the ways in which tax delinquency is enforced. And this is a complicated story but one that has resulted in massive amounts of property dispossession, as well as significant financial losses to victims of these laws. And the laws in particular can be broken down into two categories, and every state sort of has different laws on this. But essentially, there's states that will sell the deed to a home that's tax delinquent or land that's tax delinquent. And essentially, you will, if you don't, pay your property taxes, a lien is placed on your home. And then eventually, if you don't settle those debts, the local government will sell that property at a tax deed sale. Now, the other half of the U.S. states, in fact, the majority of U.S. states have what are known and run a system that could be described as a sort of tax lien sale, in sense where if you don't pay your property taxes, the moment that that bill becomes past due, the local government can, or in some states are required to sell that debt to a private investor at what are known as tax lien sales or tax lien auctions. And essentially, the investors go to these sales and they pay that person's tax debt and then can charge that homeowner or landowner interest on that debt, or they can attach fees onto that debt. And in some states, the interest can be exorbitant. In fact, in some states, it can be as high as 48% interest over the course of that period. And so this has been a vicious system that has both sort of created opportunities for predatory investing that has been disproportionately targeted at Black and brown homeowners in low-income neighborhoods. And it's also been susceptible to abuse by public officials. As I show, there's a long sordid history of African Americans, especially, during the Jim Crow era, having their land or homes sold for unpaid taxes under very dubious circumstances. And this is, as I sort of show throughout the book, has been a causal factor in the massive amounts of land that African Americans have lost over the course of the 20th century. I mean, one of the starting points of my book is during that period after Reconstruction, where in spite of never getting that 40 acres and a mule, in spite of having their civil rights stripped away and being reduced to second-class citizenship, African Americans accumulated a significant amount of land after Reconstruction. In fact, by 1910, African Americans owned upwards of 16 million acres of land in the U.S. By the end of the 20th century, that number had fallen, down to around 2 million acres. And so there was massive amounts of land that was taken from African Americans or lost over the course of the 20th century. And taxes were either a direct or proximate cause of a lot of those losses. And tax sales were one of the instruments of dispossession. And we know these are estimates that have been done through other studies, that the total amount of those losses of land taken over the course of the 20th century is alone about another $300 billion. And now I'm not arguing here that all of that land, and certainly there was many other causes of that land being lost. But if you recognize how taxes played a role in that, and how these tax sales were one of the factors that was accelerating these losses. And then you also factor in the fact that, these tax lien sales ensnared many homeowners who ultimately were able to hold on to their homes or hold on to their land, but had to pay significant financial penalties to do so. Whether it be, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in fees and interest just to hold on to their homes,
Sure.
After falling delinquent on their taxes. You can very quickly get to a number that is at 300 billion or more if you, again, expand over 150 years.
Well, the reason I asked you that question, sir, was because I've seen other reports that basically will put that value at somewhere around $3 trillion.
Yeah. I mean, again, I did not want to sort of come across as I didn't want to just pull some number out of the sky or sort of say something that, was just, that I could not sort of support. And I think, again, this, as I say in the introduction of the book, where I sort of throw those numbers out there, I say these are very conservative estimates. And in fact, if you also think about it in the sense of all that land that African Americans were taken from them, land real estate on Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, that today is worth, generates millions of dollars in wealth. I mean, so in a sense, you can very easily say, take that $300 billion in land that was lost and see how much wealth it's generating today. And we're talking about transfers of wealth that, yes, easily get into the trillions of dollars.
Now, I want to ask you this because the way I understand it, this practice, I'm going to use that word, this practice was carried out by government agencies throughout the United States, as opposed to being one particular region of the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is all local. This isn't entirely a story of local government in America. This is about counties, about municipalities, about folks operating at these kind of low-level areas of public administration, like tax assessors, county treasurers' offices. I mean, this is not the IRS here. This is not sort of something happening in Washington. In fact, this is dispersed. It's happening in localities across the country. and oftentimes is operating in the shadows of sort of the, of what we think of as the kind of instruments of racial inequality in the 20th century. I mean, that's one of the things that I really wanted to bring to the attention of readers here, is how this has been an area that we have not really looked closely at when we look at the struggles for racial justice in the 20th century, when we look at the forces that were reproducing inequality. But a lot of this is happening at these kind of lower levels of government, and kind of out of sight from many of the sort of movements of the 20th century.
Well, also, I don't know if you looked at this, but I do know that there's been an awful lot of loss of farmland and land that was stolen from farmers.
Yeah.
If you look at the number of acreages of land that has been lost to Black farmers, and the number of Black farmers is way, way, way down now compared to what it was 40, 50 years ago. And most of that land was stolen, by the government. Now, also, the other thing is, you say here, and I read here, like you say, your book is titled The Black Tax, but you go on to say 150 years of theft, exploitation, and dispossession in America share statistics, studies, and tales of Black Americans being cheated out of land ownership and pushed into poverty by racist laws and practices dating back to the Jim Crow era. So, is this to a large degree still going on in America today?
Yes, I mean, that's, I think, one of the sort of urgent calls that I hope this book sort of, or at least for readers, will lend weight to the significance of my findings in this, and what this history has to tell, is that this is a very much unresolved set of problems. And in fact, again, as I stated earlier, I mean, African-American neighborhoods and homes are still continued to be overassessed by local tax assessors. And as a result of a variety of factors within how property taxes are administered that continue to sort of disadvantage African-American homeowners and neighborhoods. African Americans remain disproportionately vulnerable to tax delinquency and to being victims of these sort of predatory tax buyers, as I described them, these folks who invest in tax liens and sort of prey on tax delinquent homeowners. This is not only still ongoing, in fact, it's actually gotten worse. Today, now we have major hedge funds and private equity who invest heavily in tax delinquent, in tax liens. You have, there was a study or a report that just came out earlier this year that found that, one of the nation's largest hedge funds was one of the biggest investors in Cook County, Illinois' tax lien sale. And the vast majority of the properties that they were buying liens on were in Black and brown neighborhoods. Those homeowners are now going to be paying exorbitant interest and fees just to hold on to their homes. So these are, and in fact, these problems have only gotten worse in recent decades as local governments have grown more desperate for revenue and more likely to try to squeeze revenue out of poor and disadvantaged and predominantly Black populations. So again, this is something that I think we need to sit up and take notice of, and sort of not just appreciate the severity of these losses over the long history that I tell, but how these are very much problems that remain with us today.
One of the things I like, sir, about what I'm reading, at least from the excerpts, is the fact that you've documented, you're just not making a statement, you've documented how this taking place. And I want to point out a couple of documents here that you give an example of Anthony Fleming and J.R. Rooks, two Black men forced off of their farmland by white supremacist mobs who went on to establish a town with the goal of enabling Black Americans to own land. By 1911, Edmonston, Arkansas encompassed 30 square miles of stores, a bank, a hotel, and post office for local Black homeowners. However, 20 years later, the town was no more after white plantation owners plotted to seize the land by imposing taxes on lots the Edmondson residents were unaware of. Once the residents failed to pay the taxes that they had no clue about, the plantation owner seized the land. It was deeded over to one of the plantation owners who had concocted the scheme and demolished all of the buildings. That's
Hmm.
one example, sir, and that's documentation. Now, there are many people, white people in this town will tell you stuff like this is made up stories. You have people like politicians like Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, who will say, well, America has never been a racist country. Okay. Systemic racism does not exist. I mean, this to me shoots a big hole in that argument.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the example of Edmonston, Arkansas, which you just described, I think is a real, I mean, this is one of the more egregious, but in many ways chilling examples here that should sort of, make us recognize just how easily local authorities could abuse these taxing powers to steal, legally steal land from folks, and how little recourse in many instances victims had in these situations. So to take the example of Edmonston, Arkansas, here was a situation where you had an independent black town founded by African American developers who were selling homes to African American families. They had their own sort of business district, their own schools, churches. They were a thriving African American town in the heart of the Arkansas Delta. This was seen as a threat to local planters who, again, were relying upon a impoverished a class of tenant workers, not homeowners, not landowners, but tenants who were dependent upon them for wages and for everything. And so, the black towns in the heart of this kind of plantation economy were seen as a threat for a variety of reasons. And so in this instance, they conspired with local public officials to essentially impose taxes on the land that they didn't even actually really impose. Like the people never even received the tax bills. They were just kind of imposed without ever actually being received. And then then of course, when they weren't paid, they declared all the land delinquent for taxes, promptly sold all the land, again, without any of the folks even knowing what was happening. And one morning they all woke up, they went to bed one night being, homeowners and an independent black town. They woke up the next morning, dispossessed of their land, homes, and their independence. And the real sort of chilling thing about that story was, you know, Thurgood Marshall was aware of this. Walter White, the head of the NAACP, was aware of this. There were lawyers on the ground in Arkansas through the Southern Tenant Farmers Union who were firing off these desperate letters to the NAACP's office in New York, asking for help to sort of, legal representation for these families. And essentially the NAACP looked at the situation, looked at the law, and realized that this was going to be a very difficult case for them to win. And it didn't also fit neatly into the kind of civil rights framework that they were pursuing. And so they just didn't do anything. And the case just died in an Arkansas courtroom where they never got justice. They lost their homes and land. And many of those families, moved north on the Great Migration. In fact, I found examples of families living on the west side of Chicago from Edmondson, Arkansas, a generation later. I mean, this is, they were fleeing from this situation, going from being an independent community to being dispossessed and displaced. And so I think, these are the sort of histories that help explain some of these larger sort of themes and struggles of the 20th century.
So let me ask this. Did your study by any chance happen to take in the Tulsa riots?
I didn't, I mean, certainly the Tulsa, race riots were form the backdrop of this story. I mean, I think in some respects, you can't really fully appreciate the history of dispossession, racial terrorism, of that befell African Americans, especially communities that were striving and actually taking strides toward economic independence in the 20th century without recognizing that history of violent displacement. Again, not just Tulsa, Forsyth County, Georgia, Florida. I mean, all of these examples of, sort of communities that experienced violent reprisal and active efforts to suppress and oppress communities. and ultimately sort of take their wealth and homes and land. And that's again, this is an important history and one that has been told, and I think needs to be continue to be told.
Sure.
One of the things that I tried to do with this story is actually kind of go even sort of to look at an even more insidious realm of this history. One again that was oftentimes not violent, that was actually carried out through sort of just entering numbers in a ledger, through the kind of bloodless bureaucratic racism that you found in Jim Crow tax assessors' offices, and also as well getting moving forward into the post Jim Crow era, the ways in which these kinds of forms of inequitable taxation and loss through tax delinquency didn't even have to be carried out by violent racists or people who are consciously engaged in acts of discrimination. It was actually just woven into the very structure of how local governments taxed and spent public dollars.
Now, another piece of documentation that you offer here, in 1920, Hillary Thomas Stewart Sr. lost 24 acres of land in a tax sale under dubious circumstances after the great-great-grandfather of George Floyd failed to pay $18.83 in taxes. Losing the land forced the Stewart family into poverty. See, this is the kind of documentation that I think is needed, very much needed. And so that's why I want to congratulate you. And I'm going to make first of all, I want to ask you, where is your book being sold at besides the Chicago press?
Well, I mean, you can hopefully it's on the shelves at your local bookstore. You can find it on Amazon for sure. And if your local bookstore doesn't have it on the shelves, then tell them to put it on the shelves. I certainly hope that it gets as wide a distribution as possible. But yeah, you can certainly find it on Amazon, and other sort of either online or sort of local booksellers.
Okay. Now, one of the things I want to bring up is this kind of information, sir, that you are documenting, excuse me, and you're publishing. Would you consider your book to be controversial by any means?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that it will generate, hopefully it'll generate conversation, discussion.
Sure it will.
I think for one, I hope that it's sort of revelatory to many audiences who are not either, and who are either not sort of as familiar with or sort of fully appreciating the sort of the history of dispossession and loss. I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to sort of do with this history, and I think one of the contributions I hope it makes to the sort of wider public's understanding of inequality in America was, oftentimes we think of the story of African-American struggles for equality in the 20th century as being a struggle against exclusion, sort of like implying that, there were things that were denied to communities that then they fought to gain access to. This is a history of dispossession. I mean, this is a history of African-Americans having things at the beginning of the 20th century and having them taken from them. This is a history of, again, like sort of, and as well, it's a history that also speaks to these features of local tax systems that actually disadvantage many white Americans as well. I mean, I think it's, by no means is it, while this is a history that focuses on and centers the experiences of African Americans and how they were disadvantaged by local tax systems that, again, like, overtaxed low-income neighborhoods and poorer homeowners that subjected, elderly or people on fixed income to these massive financial losses or the threat of entire loss of their homes to tax delinquency. This was certainly disproportionately affecting African Americans, but it was by no means only affecting them. And I think it hopefully, in some respects, this history will help shed a light on some of these features of how we administer taxation in America that actually sort of disadvantage many segments of the American populace.
Now, Professor Carl, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. If this book, and I'm sure it will be, placed in public libraries across the country, as you know, there are politicians across the country that are making policies and laws to ban these kinds of books from the public. okay, and from public institutions such as libraries, because this is a part of history they want to hide. They don't want to be exposed. Do you have any fear that your book will be placed on a ban list across the country from libraries and public institutions?
Well, I certainly hope not, of course. I mean, I think that because I think this is actually a history that can speak to many different audiences, and actually many folks can take away and gain insights to a whole host of matters. And it doesn't it I think in contrast to the sort of narratives that are often being spun by those who seek to ban books or suppress knowledge, that it in some ways kind of is pointing the fingers at certain groups or making them feel guilty or I mean, this is very much a history that focuses on structures, processes, and actually sort of focuses on sort of, it's very much a story that I think hopefully alerts us to problems within our fiscal system that demand our attention, that certainly have negatively impacted African Americans. It's also a story I should also mention here of fighting against these problems. I mean, this is not just a story of African Americans passively being sort of victimized by tax systems. It's a story of them fighting against them. And in many respects, again, if we think of sort of many of these efforts to ban books or as being a project of the right, one that actually sort of seeks to sort of advance a political project among, on the conservative or reactionary right. I mean, they might find some things to like about this book, if not my conclusions. They do like to talk about how bad taxes are. I mean, so there might be something they can identify with there, even if my conclusions are perhaps the exact opposite of what they would come to. I think if anything, it helps to sort of open up a debate. It doesn't seek to close it. In fact, it seeks to actually sort of get, and in fact, it doesn't really fit neatly into sort of some of the kind of current narratives that we often sort of have. So if anything, I hope that it will be at least, sort of received by those who might not agree with my arguments or framing of these problems, but will nevertheless be willing to engage in debate over them.
Okay, you've used the word debate there a couple of times, and I want to ask you this. As you're well aware, sir, there's been a debate ranging for quite a period of time now about reparations for African Americans in this country. Do you see this book in any way having an effect, either positive or negative, on the call for reparations for African Americans?
Well, one thing I hope it does is it actually contributes to those debates in a way that recenters the ongoing reproduction of inequality today. I mean, one of the things that whenever asked this question, I say that, any sort of movement for reparations needs to first prioritize and deal with the actual sort of structural mechanisms that are reproducing inequality in the present, that are actually driving the sort of wealth inequality and the upward redistribution of wealth in America today, which disadvantage African Americans disproportionately. That say just a kind of, handing out paychecks without changing the system is actually could very easily result in further inequality in the future. And so my argument here, and I sort of, say this in the conclusion of the book is, we need to sort of begin by say, look, if on this matter in particular, when it comes to sort of the unequal access to housing, the way in which home ownership doesn't work the same way for Black Americans as it does for white Americans, the way in which the assets and property that African Americans own are more vulnerable to loss, that Black homeowners are more vulnerable to exploitation. This is a book that explains like how that's happening and what are the sort of causes of it, and like what are the sort of mechanisms that are actually making Black homeowners more vulnerable to loss and to exploitation. So we have to sort of prioritize these sort of matters to actually understand like what's causing this, and to arrest those forces of inequality. And that's in a sense a form of reparations, because it actually sort of it's actually changing this system, because we recognize that system has been the cause of the very inequities and inequalities that we live with today. And so that's, I think, sort of priority number one in my mind. And I think we need to actually maybe think of that as a form of reparations, in the way in which we actually, sort of begin to have structural changes that are based on our knowledge of injustice in the past.
Okay. Now, and I don't know if this is at the end of your book, or I think it probably is, but you give it here, you have some possible solutions to making up for the last century of financial oppression against the Black community. Can you give me an idea of what your solutions would be?
Well, one, again, I think that, I think need to sort of look at the ways in which, more broadly, look at the ways in which we fund local governments and the critical goods and services that they provide. I mean, local governments, the property tax in particular, is the chief source of funding for public schools in America. Many of the local goods and services that we rely on every day, whether it be the roads that we drive on, the water that comes out of our faucet, the sewers that carry away our waste, the parks and playgrounds that we go to on the weekends. I mean, all these things, the public libraries that we frequent. I mean, all these are funded by local governments. And we have a system in America today that actually, sort of is increasing even more so than ever, is making local governments reliant upon their own sources of revenue to fund those critical goods and services. And that inherently sort of works to the advantage of wealthy communities and ones that are rich in resources, and it allows them to have more money to spend on these things, and actually allows them to tax their own citizens less in order to get the sort of revenue they need. And conversely, it inherently disadvantages poor and low income communities, and it reproduces inequality over time. It's actually one of the factors that leads local governments to overtax Black and brown neighborhoods at the same time as they underserve them. And so one of the things that I sort of point to is, let's think about this sort of reinvesting in local communities at the federal level. I mean, and one way to do this, again, is to think about how can we actually sort of force the people who hold all the wealth in this country, which is extremely concentrated at the top, more so than it has been at any point in our history, find ways to actually tap into that wealth and tax it so that we can actually, fund the goods and services that we need to make a more equal society. So again, a wealth tax on the 1% is an idea that has been in the public sort of discourse, increasingly so. I think that we need to continue to sort of point the finger at the folks who actually are contributing the least, while actually contributing the least, while are actually responsible for many of the problems that we're living with today, which is those who have profited so greatly and have been such a causal force of the inequality we live with today.
Okay, let me ask you this, sir. This book has been out for how long?
It came out on April 27th, so we're about 2 weeks in.
Okay. And from your vantage point, how are sales going at this point?
So I don't know in terms, I hope it's doing well. It's certainly, I'm getting a lot of, good feedback from it, from those who have read it. I've been, it's gotten some nice reviews so far, but yeah, I don't track the sales. I'm sure there's someone at the publisher who is.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But you're convinced that it's on the shelves nationwide at this time?
I hope so. And hopefully, that I hope that it will, find its way into more bookstores as, as folks begin to sort of understand what this is about, and begin to appreciate this importance of what the history that this tells and why it's really relevant to us today.
Well, I hope that it not only finds its way onto bookshelves, but I hope it also finds its way into public libraries, because many people, visit the libraries, and I think that would be an enhancement to sales.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is like I said, this is a book that I really wanted to have, out into the public sort of conversation. I mean, I intentionally wrote this in a way that explained these really complicated processes of how property is assessed for taxes, how taxes are enforced. I mean, these are very arcane laws that can be very different from place to place. And oftentimes the kind of opacity of these laws and processes, the way in which the general public often sort of, struggles to understand what's going on. That's actually been a force of these very problems, because if folks don't really understand what's going on, then they're much more vulnerable to being victimized by
Sure.
these problems.
Sure.
And so one of the things I really tried to do in writing this book is like explain this in as clear a language as possible in a way that actually, someone who's not a specialist in tax administration can understand what's going on here. And I mean, in a sense, like I wasn't a specialist in these problems, in this area before I started working on this. I didn't, I did not get training in tax, I was not trained as a tax scholar. I really, sort of learned this over time and learned it again with a sort of through trying to kind of, focus on like the essentials here. What is actually happening in a way that I can sort of both I understand and explain it to audiences in a way that they can readily appreciate. And so, in that sense, it's really written for a general audience so that hopefully we can understand what's happening here and then begin to think about what to do about it.
Listen, let me say this. I really want to thank you very much for taking your time, and I know you're busy, and I'm sure this book has gotten you a lot of attention and probably a lot of calls for speeches and interviews such as this. But I really appreciate your time. I think let me just say, there's no question that I'm going to buy this book because I do want to read the full book. Based on what I've seen here in the excerpts, it's very, very interesting. And I think it is something that everybody, and in particular African Americans, should know and should buy this book. So I want you to one more time before we go. I want you to hold up that book one more time. All right.
Here we go. All right, go out and get a copy.
There you go. The Black Tax on the bookshelves across America.
There we go. Well, thank
Professor
you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, and I appreciate it. And you've been very instrumental in getting across your points on this. And I think looking at this, like I said, the documentation that you provided is something we're not that used to. And so we appreciate you for that. So,
Well,
sir, have a good afternoon, and I appreciate you and look forward to talking with you again in the future.
absolutely. Thank you for having me on. It was a real pleasure. It's a great
My pleasure,
conversation.
sir.
All right,
Take
take
care.
care.